Greetings, comrades, and welcome back to another episode of the ComradeCast. And today we have a very politically charged episode for you guys, delving into both of the extremes. And to represent that, I have two dueling coffee mugs. And not only that, it's because it's early in the morning for me, and I'm not an early morning guy. I'm more of a let's get started at 1 or 2. Those are my most productive hours. That being said, though, don't have that luxury today. So I have brought 2 cups of coffee. The first mug I have is my coffee or die mug. And then to complement that, I have my SSSR mug. So these will represent in our coffee vessels the opposing political perspectives we are exploring today. But before we get there, I want to offer you a detour. I want to offer you a relief from the political atmosphere we have been experiencing. I know that I, as a person with a very high political tolerance, could talk about this stuff for a very long time, though over the course of my lifetime, I've realized not everybody is in the same boat. So if you want to take a second and have a reprieve from the political atmosphere, I would like you to do that with today's sponsor, me. Well, not just me. Me and someone who is very close and near to my heart. And that is my little brother, Mitch. And what the hell is happening right now? Well, let me tell you guys, I have started on a new project with my little bro, and that is we are going to review every single episode of King of the Hill that has ever come out and ever will come out. And personally, I have been wanting to do a project that is outside the realms of my political and gaming spheres for a little while. And my little brother has been wanting to get into the content creation sphere. So we kind of teamed up on this idea. And we've been working on it in the background for a while. And I originally wanted to get this out last year, but the cards didn't align. So early this year, we were finally able to record and produce our first episodes of Rainy Street Reviews. So both me and my bro grew up watching King of the Hill together. It's been a defining part of our childhoods. It's been a defining part of developing who we ended up growing up to be. And one of the great things about having a co-host for this is that my brother and I are similar, but we're also very different on a lot of different things, right? He's a little bit more right-wing than I am. He's a little bit more of a hands-on trades kind of guy, where I'm more of a intellectual sort of pie in the sky kind of person. So it's nice to bring together something that we have so much similarities on, but contrast it through our differing personalities. And obviously it's not just me talking like this. I do have my own cartoon avatar, but if King of the Hill is a show that you are a huge fan of like I am, or that you grew up watching, I would highly recommend you check out our new project, Rainy Street Reviews. I'm going to leave the link in the description. And obviously this is not replacing anything. I'm not stopping anything that I'm currently doing. I've brought in a partner this time to ensure that it's not just me shouldering all the load for this project. We've got the first 2 episodes already on the channel, with the third one coming out this Tuesday. A new episode drops every Tuesday at 12 Pacific time, 3 Eastern time. So if you're interested in any of that, or even just hearing a little bit about myself or more about myself and the circumstances I grew up in and that kind of stuff, absolutely head on over. And with that, let's return to our regularly scheduled program. So today we are going to be talking about an idea which was brought on by our boy Elon's special moment that he's had recently. And I guess I should clarify, because our boy's been having a lot of special moments over the last week or so. So I am not talking about his special moment around infighting with the H-1B visas. I'm not talking about his special moment where he faked being one of the best Path of Exile 2 players on the planet and revealed himself in the most spectacularly embarrassing fashion that anybody's ever seen. No, I am talking about this special moment where he not once, but twice does a gesture which is very similar to salutes done to praise and signal your support to far-right governments, particularly the Nazi government of the 1930s. And My favorite part about this has been watching people just embarrassing themselves, tripping over themselves, trying to somehow pretend that this obviously isn't a signal to far-right groups. Hey, I'm with you guys. Hey, I'm in your camp. Hey, I'm friendly to you. It's unreal, the amount of gaslighting that they're trying to do, trying to get us to pretend to not believe and not see what we're seeing with our lion. They'll be like, oh man, well, he only extended his arm at a 40-degree angle instead of a 45-degree angle, so it's not technically a Nazi salute. I hate this fucking pussy wishy-washy behavior. If you're gonna goose step, just come out and goose step. Just own it, please. Don't try and pretend that's not what you're doing. But to me, there are just two real killer arguments that show that this was a very intentional move and he knew what he was doing. The first being is that he did it twice, very deliberately. Once, maybe you can write it off as a spastic move, which a lot of people on the right are trying to do. They're just saying, he just got excited. He's awkward. He's a little bit autistic. He just flailed his arms in this conspicuous manner. And you know what? Once, whatever. We can let it all slide under the bridge. Sure, why not? One time is a mistake. Twice, it's deliberate. Another thing I've heard is that no, it was a Roman salute, which hilariously just gives away the game entirely. Because if you guys actually know your history, the so-called Roman salute, it's entirely fictionalized. At least we have no idea what it looked like. Even if it existed in the first place, there is zero historical evidence for the Roman salute. It was something which was depicted in 19th century literature and then later in 20th century films and eventually co-opted by fascist movements around the globe to promote and support their own ideology. So if he was doing a Roman salute, then he was obviously doing something which signaled his sympathies to far-right movements anyway, so that just gives away the game. You can get pictures of politicians and political figures holding their hands up at a 45-degree angle all the time, right? People hold their hands up at 45-degree angles during public speaking for various reasons, but these are not deliberate and repeated. These are 1-second freeze frames taken in a small moment. I'm not going to show you the whole video. You guys have seen the whole video a million times, but when you watch the video, it's very clear what he's doing. And as soon as he did it, all the far-right people came out and were like, yep, we know exactly what he's doing. Don't worry, everybody. He's still our guy, still on our team. And of course, Elon did absolutely nothing to disavow this whatsoever. Ultimately, my point here being is that if it honks like a goose and it steps like a goose, it's probably a goose stepper. But this isn't what I'm here to talk about. We all know what this is, and we're not going to spend a bunch of time pretending that it's not, particularly when this guy has constantly signaled his support to the furthest right political groups across the world. And in law enforcement, there's a rule they teach us. It's called the 1+1 rule, which is that if you find one piece of illegal activity, it's very likely that this person is doing more pieces of illegal activity. So the point here being is that if Elon has signaled sympathy to one far-right political group, why wouldn't we logically take the assumption that he would have sympathy for many, many more? But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is a thought that was actually spurred on by the Breaking Points debate on this issue. So this was the actual catalyst for what I wanted to talk about today. One of the political channels that I follow is Breaking Points. I actually usually don't have a problem with either one of them. But in this video where they're debating the Elon salute, Saagar just completely embarrasses himself, trying to defend this, trying to pretend that it's not what it really is. But my biggest problem with Saagar in particular is that I 100% feel that he hides the ball on his political beliefs. I believe he is much further to the right than he lets on in the show, and he suppresses a lot of his further right political instincts and beliefs in order to come off as more mainstream. And during this debate, he did one of the most frustrating things that a lot of right-wing people do, is where Crystal is listing off the right-wing, in particular far-right organizations in which Elon has shown support for. And he's like, well, what is right wing? What is far right anyway? And it's fascinating. Like, I see conservative people do this all the time where they will say, I believe and support in XYZ values, and they all happen to be core principles of right-wing ideology. And then you show that to them and you tell that to them. They're like, well, I'm not far right. I just happen to believe and support a number of far right things. Wow. Isn't that weird? Isn't that a weird coinkydink, huh? And you know what? I thought, okay, you know what? That's a decent question of Sagar. What is far right anyway? And that is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about what constitutes far right ideology and where its roots come from and how they can be traced specifically to far right ideals. And then in addition to that, I'm going to contrast these ideas to more far left ideas and show exactly what, as a left-wing person, we believe and how we contradict and view these concepts through our own lens. But before we get there, I do want to bring up one point that Sagar brought up in the debate and how these two examples are not similar in any way, shape, or form. He brought up that what Elon did, it's like back in 2017 when left-wing people were getting upset over the use of the OK sign. And I think that the left really lost the communication debate on this one. And we are paying for it now to this day. But the main reason why I want to quickly say that these are not similar is because this is a very benign hand gesture. Holding your hand to your chest and then extending it out at 45 degrees is not a benign gesture that people do on a frequent basis. So there's an extreme difference between the two. But the frustrating thing around the OK hand sign is that the left-wing position got hugely muddled and distorted and projected into something that it was not. What left-wing people were not saying, and anyone who was saying this is a fucking moron and doesn't know what they're doing or talking about, the left was never saying that just the use of the OK hand gesture in and of itself is showing your allegiance to white power or your sympathy to white power groups or anything like that. The message that was trying to be said and trying to be conveyed is that white power groups are co-opting this symbol, and you need to be aware of the context because sometimes it can be used as a way to signal your support for white power sympathetic organizations, but in the vast majority of times it's not. And you need to be aware of the context of when it is being used as a dog whistle and when an OK sign is just an OK sign. But one thing I've kind of strategically disagreed with a lot of my left-wing people is that we should never let far-right groups co-opt benign hand gestures and symbols in society, because if we do, that can lead to a whole lot of trouble. So I think it's important to fight back against that co-opting and make sure that, yes, there are still times when these benign, everyday messages, signals, symbols, gestures, whatever you want to say, are just their benign, everyday meanings. Just because one bad actor co-opts it doesn't mean the entire thing is poisoned. You need to cut off, quarantine, and amputate the bad corruption and keep it there. So with that, let's talk about the question at hand. What is far right anyway? If you go back to one of my previous episodes, I outlined the major component, which I think all political ideology hinges around, which is the amount of change you want in society. So someone like me, who is very revolutionary, who is very radical, sees very little in our current society that we should protect and preserve, and moves to upend and change large parts of it in hopes of building a better future for everybody. Someone who is your more traditional liberal believes that the system is fine the way it is. If we could make a few minor tweaks, maybe in and around the edges, then everything would be okay. The conservative generally wants to maintain the status quo, maybe make a few rollbacks even here and there, but by and large wants to maintain the status quo. And then lastly, on the far right, the reactionary looks to bring and drag society back to a previous point in time and seeks to emulate our current society off past archetypes rather than trying to build towards a future. So the absolute first thing I'm going to ask myself, is somebody far right? Is this ideology far right? Is this a reactionary thought process? Is this a reactionary political movement? Do they want to drag society back to a previous point in time? And this is why something like Donald Trump's Make America Great Again is inherently reactionary, because it is hearkening about dragging America back to some previous glory age. And, people on the left will oftentimes ask, well, when exactly was America great? And the reason we do this is because we want to know exactly which time you're pinpointing to try and drag America back to. So other red flags for reactionary ideas are people who will talk about how great everything was back in the 1950s. That was Americans' golden age, and we should just go right back there and make everything the same as it was in the 1950s. Another popular version of reactionary thinking is you see this a lot in sort of right-wing movements which have emerged out of Scandinavian and pagan mythology. You'll see people try and harken back to, we want to be Vikings, and the Viking era was so great, and we should take inspiration from all these Viking civilizations and bring elements of their society into our own. That's why I find people who are very obsessed with Viking culture and want to be a Viking and emulate the Viking era, that's a big red flag for me. Another one can be trying to, recast ourselves in the glory of the Roman Empire. We just got to go back to the Roman Empire times when everything was that was the pinnacle of Western civilization. Got to bring that back. That's another huge red flag. And I want to make a distinction here. Actually, let me write this down. And I want to make this very clear. This does not include having a passion or interest in history. This is something very specific, which is wanting to go back to the past or making our society akin to a society in the past. I, for one, have a very healthy interest and passion in history. For me, though, I love the Roman Empire. I love the military as much as the next guy. I love the legionaries. I love the Latin motif. But that doesn't mean I want to return to the Roman Empire or think that we should build our society to be like a Roman Empire 2.0. The one thing I like to joke is that the past would be a wonderful place to visit, terrible place to live. Ultimately, what I use history for is a guiding beacon towards the future. The best thing about knowing your history is that it teaches you your mistakes and successes and helps you build a blueprint and guideline for the future, which can avoid your ancestors' mistakes and hopefully carry on the positive things that they brought. So our next point towards what is far right anyway, what is a far right ideology? It's one which values homogeneity. And this can be in many different forms. For example, it can come in the form of wanting to promote homogeneity among ethnicity, among religion, or nationality. Oh man, I'm going to have to move this up here. I'm going to have to adjust this here a bit for our next points, but what it says behind my head, it says that this is often but not always coupled with a want to elevate the pervert group against others. So what we're talking about here is, again, this comes in many different forms. The most typical one you see right now is trying to value homogeneity around nationality, but sometimes you can see this around religion. Ethnicity is usually held for the deepest and darkest corners of the far right sphere. There are some who will come out and say that, yes, I want an ethno-state. My favorite joke is there are a lot of libertarians out there that seem to think ethnic states are really based. But the point here is that they value and elevate these kind of shared identifiers above everything, and they want everything in the society to adhere to these shared identifiers and be the same within them. As I said before, the most often one you see pushed is nationality. We want to put our citizens above everything else. Our citizens are the best. Our citizens are number one, and we shouldn't have any other citizens from anywhere else come to our country, because that would ruin our perfect homogenous little world. The underlying political value here is that if you move towards a more homogenous society, then effectively things will run better. There'll be more unity, there'll be less dissent, and people will cooperate in a better manner than they would if we had all these diverse different types of people within our society. The thing is that this always falls apart because it doesn't matter how homogenous you make your society, people will still find fault lines in which they will end up dividing themselves over. One of the perfect examples is South Korea. South Korea, an incredibly homogenous society, but right now hugely divided along gender lines. So bringing in all of this racial homogeneity didn't actually lead to a homogenous society in the end. People still found things to divide themselves over. And this is one of the things you would contrast to a left-wing proposal, is that you want to make those differences matter as little as possible in society. That yes, we're going to have people of different religions and ethnic backgrounds and moral outlooks, but just because you happen to be from one background or another background doesn't mean you should have an inherent advantage in society. And also, sometimes a lot of these identities can bleed into one another. For example, when it comes to nationality, we're seeing America go down a very nationalist route, a very nation-centric route. But a lot of the times this can bleed into racial identity as well, that people who are white are more likely to be seen as American and fit the typical bill of what you would picture as an American in your mind versus someone from another race. So this want for homogeneity often also bleeds into anti-immigration values. Obviously, we want to keep the nation as homogenous as possible, so therefore adding in any outsiders will hinder this goal and work against it. So it's from here that you get anti-immigration values and policies linked to a far-right outlook. So moving on to our third point, you'll find that far-right people often promote and value hierarchical structures. They wish to move society towards a more hierarchical structure where there is a clear authority figure and then power flows down from that authority figure. They fight against anything which would destabilize that hierarchy because they believe destabilizing the hierarchy would destabilize society. But in addition to that, far-right people want to ensure that the correct people are in the hierarchy, in the sense that they want to ensure that people in the hierarchy are in tune with their own political values and will work to defending that hierarchical structure and putting in the right people in the right places. So that's one of the key differences between someone, I would say, who is just a mainstream conservative and someone who is far right. Conservatives tend to view the world through a hierarchical lens, while as on the left, we tend to view the world through an egalitarian lens and wanting to flatten the power structures in society and give regular people as much power as possible. For someone on the far right, it isn't necessarily just enough to have a powerful and functioning hierarchy. You need to have the right people in that hierarchy, people who will promote your political values and ensure that the only people who are getting into the hierarchical club are the people who meet your criteria. People who, for example, already have a reactionary worldview, people who already value homogeneity, and people who, moving into our fourth point, they want to empower people who promote traditionalism and roll back progress. And while this dovetails into our number one point, our reactionary point, a lot of this stuff is kind of how they defend the current status quo or seek to bring us back to some sort of perceived golden age. So they promote the empowerment of traditional structures in society. Those usually come in the lines of religious institutions, promoting the patriarchal family unit, right? The whole, leave it to Beaver, daddy knows best type of family dynamic. And then they also, further than that, seek to roll back protections from minorities. They refuse to acknowledge or seek to roll back LGBTQ plus rights. And of course, these are heavily, heavily embedded in the fabric of right-wing DNA, empowering these non-traditional aspects of society, LGBTQ plus people, maybe non-traditional marriages, non-traditional family structures, ultimately ends up destabilizing society and has the potential of putting the right people out of the hierarchy and maybe moving the wrong people into the hierarchy. If all of a sudden, we give these gay people rights, they might move into positions of power in society, and they might disrupt our typical traditional ways of doing things and end up usurping and diminishing our power. So one of the ways that they seek to defend and empower these traditional positions is through religious institutions, which have defended them effectively since the beginning of their existence. So when you would compare this to a left-wing ideal, one of the big parts of left-wing ideology is that we continually extend the field of rights as time goes on. We at first only had landowning men who had political rights, and then we moved it to white men, and then all men, and then women, and now we're kind of at the cusp of trying to get political rights to trans people is where we're fighting right now. All of these groups having more power and say and ability to push society in their directions threatens those traditional hierarchical structures, and therefore people on the right will move to defend and maintain them and push out people who are trying to destabilize the traditional outlook. All right, and now we move into number 5, authoritarianism. And I have the most to say on this one because it's certainly more nuanced, because authoritarianism is something that can exist on both the right and the left. And I think that the degree to which a right-wing person is deferential to authority is a very good way in determining whether they're just kind of like your run-of-the-mill conservative or actually a far-right person. And one thing I want to specify about authoritarianism, for the far right, it has to be deference to the right person, right? They're not going to give just anybody the authority to run society. It has to be the person who conforms with all of their previous values, or else the whole effort is for naught. So first point I have here is an emphasis on strong centralized authority, often at the expense of individual freedoms. And these are a lot of the things that I am looking to a Donald Trump term and examining them and seeing, is this guy as far right as he is letting on, or is this just kind of a show to placate his base? A lot of these points are the things I'm going to be looking at. So again, we have the expense of individual freedoms being taken away. And for example, I would say one of the things that we already have creeping towards authoritarianism in the United States is the dissolution of Roe v. Wade that has very obviously taken away an individual freedom that most women used to enjoy, and has kind of delegated it to basically which state decides that you have the authority to have that freedom, right? They've given the state to decide who is, in fact, liable to have that individual freedom and who is not. Below that, we have believes in strict adherence to rules. And if you're not following those rules, they are willing to use the force of government to make you follow them. And again, this is, I would say, creeping into the United States. Well, not there yet. And this is something that I'm going to be looking towards Donald Trump, that when people don't follow the type of society that he wants and the type of society that he is trying to bring about, what is he going to do to them? Is he going to try and enforce those rules through coercion, or is he going to try a more diplomatic method? And again, one of the things I want to say here and give some credit to conservatives is that there is a spectrum. Just like for left-wing people, there's a spectrum. And for example, you can believe in wanting to have more traditional structures in society without buying into a lot of these authoritarian precepts. And because of that, I wouldn't call you far right. I would just say that you're a social conservative, if you get my drift. So yeah, I just want to kind of draw attention that I do think that these are some important characteristics and things that we should really be looking forward to seeing what they support and seeing the types of policies that they bring forward to deal with dissent, to see if they're really far right or not. Anyway, and it seeks to concentrate power in the hands of a leader or ruling elite. In this particular circumstance, it's usually one single leader who is then kind of supported in the background by various elite figures in society, usually happen to be figures who promote big business institutions. And then this is a big one, and I have seen a ton of rhetoric from Donald Trump, which is very worrying in this regard, which is views dissent and criticism as threats to societal stability. And we have seen a lot of this talk already come out of the Trump camp, that there's all these anti-American people, all these far-left Donald Trump haters that want to destroy society. What is he going to do to deal with those people? Does he view those people who don't agree with his political vision as threats to societal stability? Or is he the kind of person who is going to try and be an actual president for all Americans? And then kind of going into some of the things we said before, but the one thing I want to emphasize here is that they use state power to maintain control and suppress opposition. And often the guise they do this under is, we are maintaining order, security, and safety for society by cracking down on these people, cracking down on their personal freedoms, and potentially even jailing them or other worse consequences. So are we going to see a scenario during the Donald Trump presidency where we have some sort of protest, or we have a large group that is in opposition mobilizing to Donald Trump's political goals? What is he going to do? Is he going to try and use the arm of the state to crack down on those people as necessary for order and security? And for you yourself, if you believe that it would be necessary for Donald Trump to do something like that, then I'm sorry, you are far right. That is a very clear indication that you are a far right individual, and you should probably just accept that. So, and as I mentioned before, authoritarianism can exist on the left. Its appeals to power and what it does with that power are different, but it's still effectively authoritarianism at the end of the day. So from a more left-wing perspective, what we try to do is we try to put power in a more decentralized manner, try and put power in sort of councils. In the revolution, they were called Soviets, right? Soviet just means advice in Russian. So it's not some very super scary word or anything like that. If you're giving somebody a Soviet, you're just giving them advice. And anyway, the Soviets were effectively these advisory councils that would come together and advise the broader political structures. So obviously the point here being is that in opposition to authoritarianism, you would want to move to a more decentralized power, more decentralized democratic processes, and ultimately trying to give more people say and influence in the way society is run. All right, now last one, and I'm just going to move myself over here so you can see a bit better. And to be fair, I should have maybe done this in like order of biggest red flags to least red flags, or opposite, because number 6, I would say, is probably the least red flaggy of them all. If somebody has anti-globalist attitudes, I wouldn't inherently say you're far right just based on that. You know, you'd have to have some of these other indicators to really paint that picture. But then again, this is without a doubt a core concept of far-right ideology, and is certainly being touted in a lot of political discourse. So number 6 is anti-globalism. And this is, of course, in comparison to left-wing ideology, which is inherently global. You know, they don't call it the Internationale for no reason, trying to create a sense of class solidarity amongst all workers worldwide and realizing that we are all collectively exploited. So in contrast to that, far-right ideology takes a much more country-centric approach. So they oppose global institutions, viewing them as threats to national sovereignty. One big part of that traditional hierarchy and that traditional power structure is nation states at the top of it. And anything which would be seen as giving away that nation's power to some sort of global authority, some sort of global entity, is seen as them inherently degrading the power of the state and potentially degrading the power that their leader might have over society, ultimately ending up in some sort of societal destabilization. Going back towards that idea of homogeneity, they see globalism as undermining local cultures, economies, and traditions, bringing in the potential to erase or diminish that homogeneity within society, and again, ultimately leading to destabilizations in the power hierarchy, and ultimately leading to the potential of their envisioned society collapsing. And it's funny, as a left-wing person, I would say that I have increased my skepticism towards global institutions because they end up being funded primarily by corporate and business interests rather than some sort of interest that is actually giving a shit about what will be best for the people. So me personally, I would say I'm maybe in more of a complex position here because I do believe in the power of an international world, and I hope that we will one day get there. But in our current state, I would say the institutions which could make up a global world or a global economy are pretty lacking in defense of the working class. Anyway, though, I could go on longer and I could come up with, a few more bullet points, but I think this really covers everything we need to keep on our minds for right now. And the thing is that next time you talk to somebody and they go, "No, I'm not far right. I just believe in societal homogeneity. I just believe in holding traditional values. I just believe in a strong state and centralized authority. I just believe in anti-global values." Well, I'm sorry there, fella. You might actually be far right after all. And again, before we wrap this up, I do want to make the point that some of these are more damning than others. And just because a person has one or shares a little bit of one of these values doesn't automatically make them far right. It's one of those things that becomes more and more apparent the more of these signs you see. Just because, again, there's one small sign doesn't mean that this is like some goose-stepping Nazi. But when we kind of put these all together, there might be some fire there. There might be some fire hidden behind the smoke. And with that, I'm going to wrap this episode up. So I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you found this interesting and informative. It was one of the funner videos that I've made in a while. And I've been wanting to do more videos that may not necessarily be so steeped in current events. Yes, this was a little bit because it was a current event that spurred the idea. But I want to, especially now that the election cycle in the United States is dying down, focus a little bit more on these kind of fundamental political concepts and exploring them deeply. So with that, we're going to end this episode. And before we head out, make sure to check out our sponsor, Rainy Street Reviews, a link in the description. And until next time, this has been the Comrade, signing off for now, and you guys take care.